Well, that's a terrifying introduction. Would you like to tell a joke? Okay, so thanks for a lovely welcome. Hello, first of all. As you just heard, yeah, my name is Phil Hawksworth. I'm conscious we're probably not going to get to questions. It's a bit of a tight time slot, but I'll be around if you want to ask questions. Come and find me, or you can tweet them at me. My Twitter name is just my name, so it's easy at least for me to remember, if not for you. But please, any questions, comments, if you disagree, tweet them at me or come and find me. I'll be happy to chat. A few people so far over the last couple of days have been a little bit cautious about, the label of JSHeroes and being kind of dubbed a hero. Not so for me. I'm trying to encourage it, to be honest. This is an illustration that a colleague of mine once did of me as a superhero. I was delighted about that, except it turned out that it wasn't me as a superhero. It was actually a villain, because this was an illustration that was done by a creative director at an agency I worked out at the point that I was the technology director there, and his friendly nickname for me was the Dream Crusher. So that's the label that I was uncomfortable having. But this is actually an illustration he did of me actually crushing one of his dreams, so you could see what that was like. And so he went on to kind of create this illustration, and if you look closely at the buckle there, that actually is the dream being crushed. He went and did this entire brand exploration for me. He was very thorough, so not so much a hero, but a villain, which is troubling because, like many of you here, I love making things. My history is in building things for the web. I've been doing that for about 20 years. And that's been a variety of places, a few different kind of client-side places. I've been at a few different agencies. And more recently, I joined a company called Netlify. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I don't want this to be a sales pitch for Netlify. You wouldn't thank me for that, especially at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on day 2 of a busy conference. So Netlify do kind of web hosting and automation, trying to make it easier for people to build things and get them out onto the web. So my kind of track record at different conferences and doing different talks has been influenced by my background. Now, I mentioned I've worked at a number of agencies. When you work at an agency, you often have to work with clients' infrastructure, and that can be painful at times. So I did this talk once upon a time called I Can Smell Your CMS, which was all about the fact that content management systems litter your beautiful code with their own junk. And so that was very much a bit of therapy for me, talking about content management systems. And I followed that up with a talk about static sites and how static sites can go further than maybe you might expect. I'm painfully aware that 2 talks, one about content management systems, one about static sites, that doesn't sound very exciting. So for this talk, I wanted to, I kind of wanted to jazz it up a little bit, which is why I went for this rather natty title of Serving for the Win, Deployments and Hosting for the Rest of Us. Now, actually, in the context of all of the other things I've seen over the last day or so, that's not very exciting either, so I thought I'd jazz it up a bit. Hopefully now you're excited, because it's kind of tough after things like seeing all of the talks and things like Stephanie's amazing talks with all the LEDs and all this exciting stuff. This might be a bit dry, and actually it's not something that's necessarily very exotic or very new. This is kind of a talk about fundamentals, because we learn a lot at conferences. We learn a lot at this one. We've had 21 talks already and counting. This is talk 22, so I hope you're hanging in there. Bravo for still being awake and kind of ready to learn. And so we kind of learn all of these things, whether that's using iterators and recursion, like we heard in Aniana's talk earlier on, or things like Vue and serverless, the things we're hearing from Sarah, or the kind of things I heard from Matthias earlier on, where he was talking about how 0 is not 0, and it's true and it's false. I'm not really surprised there are so many questions for Matt. And so I guess my point really is that combining all of the things that we learn at conference, just to theory, is a kind of a waste. And confining these learnings to our local development environments is also kind of a waste. Really, we want to make sure that all of this good stuff actually reaches our users and gets out into the world. To do that takes a certain kind of a mindset, and it kind of takes a certain set of processes to do that. And that's what I really want to talk about. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, great, half an hour of slides about process, and that's that's not unfair. And so what I really want to do is try and make that interesting. So over the next 25 minutes or so, I'm going to talk a little bit about where it hurts in software development and in web development in particular. I'm going to do that and talk over a few stories, things from my past, projects I've worked on that either have gone very well or have maybe gone not quite so well, and maybe the lessons from that. And then I'll try and wrap up with some talk about, the mindsets and maybe some of the resources that can help us, be a bit more successful. So that's the plan. So where does it hurt? Let's start there. So it's probably not too much of a news flash, to learn that, projects usually involve clients, they involve deadlines, they involve, often quite a lot of complexity, and that can result in some sleepless nights if you're responsible for, getting something delivered. If we look at the perfect project timeline and go from start to finish and see how this unpacks, well, we start hopefully with some kind of a brief from the client, and then we end with the awards. Any questions at this point? Is that reasonable? Okay, so well, in actual fact, it's rarely perfect. Actually, when we look at it in a bit more detail, because you'll notice no work has been done here yet. At some point, we need to actually start doing some work, and at some point, we'll hopefully launch something. Before we can start doing the work, and after we've got the brief, we'll probably have some kind of scoping exercise where we'll figure out exactly what it is we're going to try and build. And before we launch it, the client is likely to want to kind of sign it off and confirm we've built what they were expecting. So before they sign that off, chances are they're going to want to have some kind of a review to kind of make sure everything's as expected. And so with those things in place, we'll maybe start doing the work and start kind of creating things for people to see. After we've been going a while, at that point, we'll take a look at it, the client will take a look at it, and then we'll rescope. That often happens at that point. So we'll now figure out what we should have been making, and then we get back into building things again. We're starting to go a bit faster now. The work's getting a bit denser. We're maybe picking up the pace a little bit to reach this client review. So now that we can be confident that we'll get to sign off, and then we'll have to make changes because the client has some feedback. So things will start, the pace will really pick up now. We're working with a bit of urgency. Maybe some of our kind of fundamentals, some of our processes aren't quite standing up to what we're having to do because we're making compromises. That's the risky bit, because then something happens which that should be on the line, right? We know that that's in the wrong place, but something's gone awry there. So now we're having to scramble to get the project back on track. Hopefully the next deploy will be perfect. Okay, well that's not perfect. That's inexplicably a piece of fruit, and it's not on the project timeline where we'd expect it. So things are starting to kind of unravel a little bit. We scramble, we do some more work to get back online so that we can get to the final sign-off. We get there, the client gives us the go-ahead, except it's not final sign-off, it's final sign-off. So then there's some more work that happens after the final sign-off. Then we get to launch, and then happily the work's out there, so we just have to do a few more things to get the fixes done, and then we're done. So you can see that, even without really looking at what we're doing, we know that there's some complexity in projects, right? There's a time of kind of scrambly, sweaty palm moments, which means that on launch day, actually hitting the button to go live can be nerve-wracking. I stole this directly from MailChimp. Anyone who sent out there's a few people, that's exactly what it feels like when you're going to be arriving in the inbox of lots of people. Project launch days can be very much like that, and they shouldn't really need to be, but projects can be hard, of course they are. Projects often involve a lot of learning, they involve a lot of change, and it's how we manage that can really dictate how nerve-wracking it is to deploy something on go-live day. Now, infrastructure's changed over the years. If we kind of look at our approach to infrastructure and how that's changed over time, we can see that there's been a lot of changes. Once upon a time, we were managing our own hardware. We were buying racks, we were building server rooms, we were making sure there were fire retardants and cooling and infrastructure in there that we'd provide. And then, later on, maybe we started renting some rack space in a facility. I don't mean rack space, I mean space in a rack. So not rack space, but rack space. It's confusing. But yeah, we'd be buying space in a facility that would do everything but the server, and we'd drop the server in and then manage it there. Then later on, it started to get to being virtual servers, maybe something like rack space. Again, confusing. This is actual rack space. place. And it kept on moving. Things have kept on progressing. Now there's things like software as a service, and you've already seen at least one talk in this conference about functions as a service. This so-called serverless infrastructure, where yes, we know there are servers involved, but you don't have to take care of them. So functions as a service, where you're actually just buying cycle time for your functions. So as our approach to infrastructure has really changed and evolved over the years, that really needs to change our deployment conventions as well. And sometimes we're kind of holding on to things of the past a little bit. When our approach kind of gets updated, things can really help us. It kind of hurts when we're managing change in a project. It hurts when we're managing the unknowable, because we never know all the answers when we start a project. And it's usually at that kind of the right-hand end of that line where things were getting a little bit choppy. That's when it hurts at crunch time and when the pressure really mounts. So I want to just kind of get into the stories as fast as I can. So story number one is deploying on my first day. Now, this is something that happened to me a few jobs ago, where I joined an agency, and on my first day, the team was doing, they were going live on a project they'd been working on for a while, and it was a large nationwide healthcare site. So it's a site that it really mattered. It was very high profile, a big deal for the agency. So I was being shown around the office. It was my first day. I'd been shown where the toilets were. I'd been shown where the coffee was. But before I had to put any coffee into my coffee mug, my new boss said this. He said, "We're having problems. Can you help? The site should have gone live on Friday." Now, this was a Monday morning. But anyway, this kind of sentence kind of raises a few questions for me anyway. The fact that a big site should have gone live on a Friday. That's another talk. We'll worry about that another time. But the next question he asked was, can you help the team figure out the deployment? And I thought, sure, yeah, I'll lend a hand. All hands to the pumps. Let me get involved. And so really what we're talking about here is, and yes, the fruit has changed, but that's because you never know what that's going to be. That's very much true of deployments that happen there. You can never tell what you're going to get. But what was happening in this environment was that we were trying to figure out deployment here, right at launch time and maybe just a bit afterwards. Of course, that's not what they'd hoped for. They hoped to do it a bit earlier. They hoped to do it there, because doing that is no fun, and they didn't need to do it until it goes live, so that was the plan. So the timing of that, as you might imagine, is not ideal. But I actually want to talk about the deployment process itself. Okay, so this should look kind of familiar to lots of people. We had a production environment where our website needed to live, and we had a staging environment where the website happily was at the moment. The eagle-eyed amongst you will probably notice that these two things are not currently the same. Now, that's obviously a problem. We want these environments to be the perfect facsimile of each other so that we have confidence in what we're deploying. The problem here was that the deploy process involved two FTP windows into two environments, and someone manually dragging and dropping files from one to the other, and then hitting reload in their browser and going, no. And then doing another one. And then over time, as frustration and kind of panic started to mount, our developer, we'll call him Bob, started also dragging some files from his local development environment over to live as well, because staging, schmaging. And then Alice got involved as well, and she was dragging things from her other slightly different looking environments as well. And so this is a little bit of a problem, because of FTP, we end up in this environment where we're kind of got an unknowable state. We don't really know what the state of any of the environments now is, and it's also an unrepeatable process. So even once we've got it right, we don't necessarily know how we've got there. So, did it go live? Yes, it did. I'm happy to say it did go live. Was it correct? Yes, it was. It probably was. Honestly, I don't know if we can ever say if it was really correct. The client signed it off, so fine. The most important question, though, is how did the next deployment go? Because, once we've got there, how can we be sure that we can do the next one comfortably? I'm not ready to talk about it yet. It was almost 10 years ago, and I'm almost there. I'll keep you posted. Do I need a hug? Yes, I do. Now, all is not lost here, because there are some lessons to learn along the way from this. And the first one that I'd share is that version control should really extend all the way to your deployments. version control was being used at this agency, but it was kind of being used as a place to keep the project rather than something that fed the process through deployment. And so it only is as good really as far as it reaches. So we really want to reach the deployment environment with our version control. The next lesson I'd say is that human intervention in deployments is really undesirable. We're not very good as humans at doing the same thing repeatably and predictably every time without screwing it up. So if we can get ourselves out of that process as much as possible, all the better. And the last one is that holistic deploys are far preferable to piecemeal deploys. So in other words, this kind of dragging one file at a time and changing the state of your production server piece by piece is nowhere near as good as actually producing an entire deployment that you're confident with and then shipping that. So we'll return to that in a second. Okay, let's move on to story number 2. So this one is a project called Searching for Syria, which I worked on at the last agency I was at, an agency called RGA. And is this gonna play, I wonder? Maybe, potentially. Okay, maybe not. Well, regardless, this was a site that was built for a client which was Google, along with another client which was the UNHCR, which is the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. And the purpose of this site was to really share the plight of Syrian refugees and really show the fact that this was a country that was very similar to lots of other countries, and we really should think of it a little bit differently and think about how we could actually help. So it was a project that I was particularly proud of. It was a project that was fairly complex in terms of its messaging. It had lots of change over the time of the project, as you might imagine. We had a great deal of political sensitivity, not just in terms of what we were saying, but also how are we saying it? How would the different parties be, considered when we're talking about this kind of subject? It doesn't want to be too preachy. It doesn't want to look like we're trying to push a particular agenda or set of products or anything like that. And there's a great deal of diversity in the stakeholders. Lots of different people had very different views about what this should be. So couple that with the fact that it was going to have a global launch into lots of languages, into lots of countries. This is a project I didn't want to mess up. So this was not going to cut it for me. So this kind of process wasn't going to be okay. So the first thing we wanted to do here is change when we figured out deployment and do that as early as we possibly could, which we certainly did. And once we've done that, yes, there's still going to be that kind of troublesome time at the end of the project, but with every deployment that we did, we were proving the deployment process, proving the environments throughout the process. So these things that were kind of on the or off the happy path, we could be confident that those would go away, and there'd be other things to keep us occupied. Now, the platform that we built this on top of, given that it was a project for Google, you might expect we'd be using Google infrastructure, and that's certainly what we did. We used Google Cloud Compute, and we're using App Engine for this. And this worked out really nicely for us because we had to think a little bit about what kind of deliveries we're going to have across the project. We're going to have to deliver things to our QA team. We're going to have to deliver things to the producers so that we could be sure that we're progressing in the way that we hoped for. We'd have to do deliveries to the translation teams that would translate the content of the site, do some localization as well, and then get those things back into the site and then validate all of that. The client needed to have deliveries that they could review, and you can be certain that the client's bosses, because of the sensitivity of this, also wanted to review things. And of course, ultimately, we needed to deliver something to the public at large. So we had this kind of ambition where, we wanted to make sure that we could deliver any version of the site at any time throughout the length of the project. And so the way that we tackled this was by employing our friend version control. Now, the way that we did it was that we made this decision that every time that we tagged the site in our Git repository, that would automatically generate a version of a site that would be available as a resource at a URL. Now, I love URLs. URLs are the web's superpower, and I hopefully be amongst friends in saying that I'm a bit of a URL nerd in this room. But there is an attribute of URLs which is not great, which is kind of troubling to me. It's something that a friend of mine shared with me a few years ago, and I make it my business to share it with everyone else because I don't want to be damaged alone. And that is that every URL starts with HTTP double meh. And my friend Alex Sexton told me about this. And if you're trying to figure out where the double meh is, there he is. There's the double meh right there. This information adds nothing to the talk whatsoever, but I feel it's my responsibility to share this knowledge so I'm not damaged alone. You'll never look at another URL in the same way. Sorry about that. Okay, what were we talking about? Tags. Okay, so every time we tag the code, it would yield a version of the site that we'd be able to review later on. Now, this was huge. Let me show you how this worked. So we needed to get our site from its development environment over to the production environment. So we did this via Git. That's where all of our code was being managed. And so we had a continuous integration server. I think it was Jenkins in this instance. And that was watching Git. And whenever something was tagged in Git, that would run our build, generate a version of the site that would push to the staging environment automatically. And then at some point, we could move that over to production. Now, in actual fact, having these two environments, staging and production, isn't actually ideal. We want to unify these things. And that's something that we got through using Google Cloud Compute. So this is a view of the console in App Engine. Now, sadly, this isn't a view of the console on this project, because I took this screenshot after I left the company. But it's very, very representative of what we saw. So if we just look at the particular part of interest here, what we can see is that every version of the site now, whoever was working on this particular project looked like they were versioning things with a date stamp. But each version is there in the environment and available to route traffic to. All of the traffic here is being routed to the latest version. But what you can do is you can also access any of the previous versions on a particular URL that includes that version. And then at any time you can start shaping the traffic from one place to another. Now this is great because it means that we move from this kind of setup over to this kind of setup, where we don't have two different environments that we have to keep the same. We've got one thing, it's the production environment, and if that works, then we know we're going to be in good shape. So, over time, what we can do is, each new version comes in, and that gets staged there, so we can access that via a URL. And then when we're happy with which one we want to go live, then we can change to the latest one and simply be shaping traffic on the same environment. So this is great because it means that all of the demos, all of the discussion, all of the tests that we're running, the issues that are being logged, and even the sign-off, that's being done against known versions of the site. We know that because the version is right there in the URL. And that's great. Doing things against known versions is just a big win. So let's move on to the lessons from that. As I just said, addressable and accessible build versions are just a huge win for the project because you can be looking at things knowing that you're all looking at the same thing. Deciding when and what to tag requires some coordination. That's something I might do a little bit differently. Rather than people deciding what's going to generate a build, I think we can do better than that. But key to this is that immutable deploys to a production environment completely remove any uncertainty. Well, completely, that's a dangerous thing to say. But it removes uncertainty from the launch day because we know that each version has its own integrity and we're on the same environment that ultimately we'll be serving the site for when we push that button. Okay, let's move on. So story number 3 is Netlify building Netlify. So I joined Netlify just in December, so I haven't been there a very long time. And I joined Netlify at a point that we were doing a bit of a redesign and a rebuild of the website, which is great because I got to see some of the processes in play. So this is the site that we were working on, and things have been changing there. But as you might imagine, since we host sites, we're going to be hosting it ourselves on our own infrastructure. So that means that Netlify.com is a Jamstack site hosted on Netlify using Netlify to Netlify. I'm conscious that feels a little bit like Inception. Hanyana was talking about tail call optimization earlier on, talking about Inception. Don't want to make this sound too complicated, and it's really not. Let's look at this picture again. So this is the environment we had in the last example on Google Cloud Compute and using Jenkins for the CI. The way that Netlify works is actually the CI and the CD infrastructure and the hosting infrastructure all within the same place. So here Netlify is watching for changes in Git, running the build itself, and then deploying to its CDN on your behalf. This is great because this means that our Git-based workflow reaches all the way through to production, like I was talking about earlier on. Well, I'll show some examples of that in just a second. But I also just want to call out this term. So I dropped that in very, very casually earlier on, and I'm confident that it doesn't really mean a lot to a lot of people, and that's reasonable. So let me just explain what that is. So the Jamstack is a phrase that's kind of emerging a little bit, and it's talking about JavaScript, APIs, and markup. You could talk about it being, you know, a new term for static sites, but actually it kind of goes a bit further than that. And let me unpack a little bit more about what that is. So in this scenario, you know, a lot of times we can build sites with some kind of build step or static site generation or something of that nature. So in our development environment, if we've got a build like this that takes maybe our markup and some other front-end assets, maybe some JavaScript as well, packages those up, maybe applies some templates, and then outputs a site that is a static, deployable asset that we can get out to the CDN. That's the essence of a Jamstack site. Except, you know, we've got no APIs in there. APIs can be called on at build time to, you know, source our content from perhaps a headless CMS, such as something like Contentful, or other data sources that we might be pulling in, enriching our site, and then producing this deployable asset. Now, of course, once it's deployed, this kind of statically hosted site, that itself could contain JavaScript. You know, we could be packaging that up, and that then can be calling APIs as well, enriching the behavior further at that stage as well. And that's kind of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about a Jamstack site. So in the context of Netlify, which I mentioned was a Jamstack site, you know, we're creating this UI, the site at the front end, but then the APIs and the things behind it, you know, the background of the product at Netlify that we're managing, that's all kind of upstream of us. We're not really worrying about that in this context. This is the project to build out the UI and the site that sits atop that. So I mentioned that builds are based on, you know, on Git activity, they're based on Git commits. So we have kind of a history. So I'm just going to show you kind of quickly what things look like in Netlify, kind of similar to as we looked at in Google Cloud Compute. So once I go into a site, I can look at the deploys, and I can look back through over the history of all of the deploys that have been done. You see some have published, there's one that's failed, different types of deploys that have happened. But ultimately, you know, if we go and dig into one production build, we can see all of the logs that happened when the build was run, when it was generated. We can even look through to see in GitHub what the commit was that triggered that build. And then we can go off and look at a production version of that build. Just pause it there for a second. You may just be able to make out, it's a little bit small on the screen, but the URL there, that's a unique URL which is unique to that instance of the site, that deploy. That's an immutable build that you can always browse. I mentioned kind of URLs for the win. That's there in perpetuity, so that's always something you can share and kind of have people test against. So that's kind of the way that deploys look in Netlify. And again, what we're talking about there is, you know, the site that's output to the CDN. Since we have that kind of decoupling, it means that you can step back and forward through your versions, you know, very easily by going and looking at that deployed URL. And since they speak to the same versioned API, that gives you quite a lot of flexibility and a lot of control. This is a view of Netlify as it was 2 years ago. This is the same UI that I just showed you, but the 2-year-old version. These aren't screenshots that were captured. Well, they were screenshots that were captured from, you know, recently from a real deployment, because what I actually did was I just went to that URL and looked at the site as it was then. It was still accessing the same API. I was still able to use things in exactly the same way. This is it a year later, and this is it as it is now. Now, obviously, I wouldn't necessarily roll things back 2 years, but knowing that you can roll a UI forward and backwards through your different deploys gives you a lot of freedom and a lot of flexibility, and it's kind of peace of mind. Oh goodness, time's getting on quickly. Okay, so I also mentioned that this is kind of automation based on Git activity. So we can build on the kind of conventions that we use for other things as well. So we can build on pull requests. So I just wanted to show you a quick look at creating builds from a pull request. So rather than actually deciding that we've merged some code and that's good to go, even creating a pull request, and this is looking at the view of a pull request in GitHub, here in the conversation about that pull request, we've automatically generated a build and put the link to that into the conversation. So just to recap what that is, that's a link to a view of the site as it will look in the future if you choose to merge that request in. So that's kind of looking into the future, which I find is kind of a crazy superpower when you can look at, you know, how things will look versus how things look now, and then decide whether you want to merge in that code or not. It's really powerful. I'm going to move on in the interest of time. So this gives us kind of confidence in the future state of the project. rattling through some lessons quickly. So embracing version control conventions removes the need to reinvent them. We often find ourselves reinventing some of the tasks that version control already does for us. So building on top of that actually can be much simpler for us. Reducing the friction to building things and deploying things just brings all kinds of agility and confidence. If you know that you can deploy things many times an hour, many times a minute perhaps, it means that deploying is much less worrisome. And static sites or these Jamstack sites can go so much further than just a static experience because they're talking to APIs and they can be enriched in ways that you might not think of immediately. Okay, so I'm rapidly running out of time, so I want to get to mindsets and resources. Other things can do some of these capabilities that I showed you very, very quickly there. So certainly things like Jenkins can do your continuous integration, your continuous deployment, and sites like Circle CI, which are a software as a service version of that, can do likewise. I'd really recommend checking out some of the resources both at jamstack.org and also the newdynamic.org, which has all kinds of writings about these kind of approaches, these kind of architectures, and I think it's a really useful resource. As is the power of serverless.info, which is a site that Chris Coyer pulled together, pulling all of these resources together about serverless infrastructure, Jamstack infrastructure, and the like. I think that's a really useful one to check out. There's a wealth of information there. When it comes to mindsets, it might not be a surprise to you to hear me say, just go for version control for everything. The further it can reach into your production environment and your deploy processes, the better. If deployments are scripted, then you can version those as well, which brings me to this point, this kind of note on deployment. Make it scripted so that you can actually iterate that over time, change the script that runs as things change. That can be versioned as well. Make it automated. Sit it on top of the kind of structures, the kind of behaviors that you already do so you can trigger things within your day-to-day workflow. Make it real. There's no point having deployments that do deployments to environments that you're not actually going to use. Try and get to the point that you're making changes on the real environment that things will be working on later on. That'll make things really a lot more robust for you, particularly as you make it first, make it at the beginning so you get a chance to refine and fine-tune that over time. Sarah said at the very beginning of the day, I feed on chaos, and that's great, and you should always expect times of chaos in a project. No matter how much work you do up front, things are always going to get chaotic towards the end of the project. But don't let chaos be introduced by poor processes or things that you might have been able to kind of abstract away. It's an awfully big stack at the moment. There's a lot to learn. We've seen a lot of that over the last couple of days. And I'd suggest don't be shy about using the expertise, the skills of others, because some of these problems have been solved by people who make that their domain expertise, and you can really leverage that. Conferences like this, I think, give all kinds of inspiration for the things that we could be doing, the ways that we could be working. And we're kind of, we're in this together, which is what I love about events like this. So with that said, build beautiful things, whether they're visually beautiful or they just do a really good job of what we're trying to achieve. Bring solutions to the people that we need to deliver projects to. With that, apologies, I'm a couple of minutes over. My slides are online now at hawksworks.com, which is my site, /talks/JSHeroes. I'll be around if you'd like to ask me questions or wag your finger at me because you disagree and you love deploying with FTP, and that's fine. With that, thanks ever so much. I appreciate it. Thanks for your time.